Hey everyone, this is Dullahan, your sleep storyteller. Before you fall asleep, be sure to like and subscribe to listen to more of my stories. Tell us where you're from in the comments, cozy up, and relax. The path felt familiar underfoot, but there was a weight in my chest as I walked the misty trail winding up the mountainside, heavier than the pack slung across my shoulders. It had been 6 months since I'd set foot here. 6 months since I'd made up excuses to transfer to a quieter part of the park, and 6 months since we lost Sarah Collins. I told myself this was just another morning. Shenandoah's trails were calm, blanketed in early fog that made everything feel muffled and distant. The air held that strange stillness I used to appreciate, the kind where every breath seemed suspended. But now, every crackle of leaves and snap of branches behind me felt too loud, too close. I had come back to answer questions, to put this whole thing to rest, but every step forward felt like I was walking towards something I didn't want to see. I shook off the feeling, trying to remember my routine. But my mind kept drifting back to Sarah. She'd been just 22, young and bright, camping alone on her first trip. The day she went missing, we had found her car parked neatly along the trailhead, her supplies organized just the way she'd described in her permit form. A simple, straightforward trip, she'd written. A week alone in the wilderness, something she'd looked forward to for years. Back then, I thought we'd find her within hours. Hikers get lost all the time. Most are confused but unharmed, a little embarrassed as we walk them back to their cars. But Sarah had vanished without a trace. The search dragged on for weeks, pulling in more volunteers, more dog teams, all combing the forest. By the end, we'd found nothing. No campsite, no food wrappers, not even a scrap of fabric. Just her empty car waiting at the trailhead, headlights pointed at the trees like it was watching her disappear. Since then, I'd run every detail through my mind 1,000 times. Had we missed something? Did she walk off trail to chase some wild instinct? Or was she pushed? The theories spun out endlessly, each one crueler than the last. But one fact stood out, fixed and undeniable. I had led the search that failed her, and I hadn't stopped looking until today, when I was determined to see it through. The trail curved, and I paused. It was quiet. Shenandoah's early mornings are usually alive with... I hadn't expected to find anything substantial that day, just traces of the past. An old stake or a scrap of tape left by the search teams. But as I moved deeper into the woods, something shifted. I felt drawn, pulled toward a section of trail that veered off sharply, an area I hadn't thought to revisit before. I kept walking, telling myself it was just my curiosity at work, just my need for closure. The forest was dense here, the trees packed tightly together, their shadows twisting in the mist. I rounded a bend, and there it was, a small, abandoned campsite, hidden in a hollow under a thick canopy of branches. The tent stood weathered but intact, partially concealed by fallen leaves and undergrowth. The air around it felt colder, damp and oddly still, as though this little pocket of the forest had been frozen in time. I froze, my breath catching. This wasn't possible. We'd scoured this area endlessly, combing every inch. And yet, here it was. Sarah's tent, unmistakably hers. The faded blue tarp, the frayed edges I remembered from the photograph her family had shown us during the search. I moved closer, feeling a chill that went bone deep. There was something disturbingly ordinary about the setup, as if she'd just left for a short walk and would return any minute. Her lantern sat near the entrance, its batteries long dead, and a small pile of packaged food lay untouched, preserved in their plastic, as if they'd been waiting for her. I crouched down, running my fingers over one of the packages, realizing how odd it felt for this scene to remain so pristine after months exposed to the elements. Inside the tent, her sleeping bag lay half unzipped, her pack propped up against a corner. My eyes caught a small notebook next to it, its edges warped slightly from moisture. It was her journal, the one she must have carried with her on the trip. My hands felt clammy as I reached for it, hesitating, as though touching it would somehow make her disappearance more real. Finally, I picked it up and opened to the last few entries. The early pages were lighthearted, filled with excited notes about her first solo hike, thoughts on the sunsets, and small sketches of leaves and wildflowers. But as I flipped further, the tone changed. Her handwriting became uneven, words scratched out or written over. Feel like someone's been watching me. I read that line twice, my pulse quickening. I scanned further, my eyes catching broken fragments that left me uneasy. Heard footsteps outside my tent last night. Too dark to see. Kept telling myself it was just an animal, but each line drew me further into her final days, and I felt a strange pressure building, a pull in the air around me. She described nights where she'd lie awake, listening to faint rustling. The journal stayed with me as I made my way back toward the trail, but every few steps I stopped, glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt heavier, like it was closing in, the trees pressing tighter together, blocking out the light. It wasn't even noon, yet the shadows felt long, stretching unnaturally as I moved through them. I tried to shake off the feeling, to remind myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I'd come here looking for something strange, something unnatural. And now my mind was filling in the blanks. But Sarah's words from the journal circled through my mind. Footsteps, shadows, dirt on my sleeping bag. She'd felt watched, and now so did I. The sound came again, a faint crackle of leaves off to my left, just beyond my line of sight. I stopped, listening, my breath shallow. "Hello," I called, half hoping one of the other rangers was out here, maybe checking on me. But my voice fell flat against the trees, swallowed by the dense canopy. I continued walking, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. But the sense of being watched wouldn't leave, like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. I thought of the local stories, the ones I'd laughed off before. Old tales of the Watchers, spirits that guarded certain stretches of the forest, supposedly claiming anyone who wandered too far into their territory. My mind flashed back to a time when an older ranger, Ben, had warned me to steer clear of certain trails after dark. "Some things out here don't like company," he'd said. Back then, I'd laughed. Now, alone in the silence, the memory felt a little too real. As I walked, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing, just the shifting mist. My pulse hammered in my ears and I felt a chill creeping up my spine. The shadow had been there, I was sure of it. But now, there was only silence. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing down the urge to turn back. I'd come this far, and I couldn't leave now. But as I continued, the shadows seemed to multiply, each one darker than the last, lurking at the edge of my vision. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, the forest playing tricks on me. But my body felt tense, my senses heightened, alert to every shift of light and sound. The trail ahead curved sharply, and I hesitated, gripping Sarah's journal a little tighter. The path here was different, overgrown, as though no one had set foot here in years. I wondered if this was the spot where she'd started to feel it too, that creeping sense of something watching from the darkness. I stepped forward, heart pounding, feeling the weight of the trees pressing in. As I rounded the bend, I saw it again, a shadow, darker than the trees around it, standing perfectly still. As I finally broke through a gap in the trees, I saw the outline of Sarah's tent in the distance, half hidden by the underbrush. My heart pounded harder. I hadn't meant to come back here, hadn't intended to revisit the place that felt like the heart of all this. But it was as if the forest itself had led me here, pulling me back to where it had all begun. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, feeling the weight of the silence settle around me. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, but the shadows were still, hiding whatever secrets they held. With Sarah's journal clutched in my hand, I made my way back toward her tent, feeling the pull of whatever was left unresolved. The forest hadn't let her go, and I was starting to wonder if it would ever let me go either. I didn't want to go back into that tent, but I found myself standing at its entrance, almost as if my feet had carried me there without my permission. The tent seemed smaller now, claustrophobic, as though the weight of time had pressed it down. And yet it felt disturbingly untouched, as if Sarah herself had stepped out only moments ago. I swallowed hard, bracing myself, and ducked inside. Inside, the air was stale and cold. I could still see the outline of her things, her belongings frozen in time like a ghostly imprint of the life that had passed through here. The journal in my hand felt heavier, as though its pages were pulling me down into her story, demanding to be read. I sat, crossed-legged, in the exact spot where her sleeping bag lay, and opened the journal to the last few pages. Her handwriting became more jagged and rushed with each entry, the letters sometimes slanting off the lines, as though she'd been scribbling in a hurry. I could practically feel her fear bleeding through the ink, her words vibrating with a tension that seemed to reach out and grab me. Can't sleep, it's too quiet. But every time I close my eyes, I hear something. My eyes traced each line, feeling her fear rise with each sentence. Footsteps, like someone pacing just outside the tent, but when I peek out, there's nothing there. I keep telling myself it's just animals, but it doesn't feel right. I think someone's out here. I felt a shiver run through me. Her experiences mirrored my own. The whispers, the footsteps, the overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as if I was reliving her fear, retracing her steps. Last night I thought I saw someone. Just a shadow, but it was standing over me, watching me through the tent wall. The words were scribbled, erratic, as if she'd written them in the dark. I told myself it was a nightmare, but I don't know. I feel like I'm losing track of time. It's harder and harder to remember how long I've been out here. The forest outside the tent felt dense and heavy, pressing in as if it wanted me to read faster, to get to the end. I turned the page and found the final entry. My breath caught as I read it. If you find this, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Her handwriting trailed off into an ink-smudged blotch, like her hand had slipped or something had interrupted her. The last words she'd written were barely legible, faint and scratched, but I could just make them out. They're watching me. They want me to stay. A chill crawled up my spine. I could feel her terror in those last few words, the desperation, the resignation. I could see her sitting here, writing in the dark, her hands shaking as she realized she was trapped. And suddenly, the tent felt even smaller, the air too thick, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I bolted upright, the journal slipping from my hands, and staggered out of the tent, gulping in the fresh air. But the forest felt different now. The shadows loomed closer, darker, more defined, like 100 pairs of eyes watching from the tree line. My thoughts were racing. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. Something in these woods had taken her, and now it felt like it was coming for me. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself I was a ranger, trained to handle fear and stay rational. But no training prepared you for this, for the shadows that seemed to thicken with every step, for the feeling of being surrounded by something unseen, ancient, and patient. As I stood there, frozen, I felt a faint whisper drift through the trees, faint but unmistakable, like someone calling my name from far off. The sound was low, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, and it sounded like her. I scanned the trees, heart pounding, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. "Sarah," I called out, my voice barely breaking the silence. The forest absorbed the sound, turning my own voice hollow, lost in the depths of the trees. Then I saw it. Just beyond the tent, a dark figure standing at the edge of my vision. It looked human, but there was something wrong with its posture, its stance too rigid, as if it were a shadow cast by nothing. My pulse hammered as I stared, willing myself to move, to say something. I didn't wait. I turned and headed down the trail as fast as I could without breaking into a run. My mind was racing, every nerve on edge, the shadows of the trees pressing close as though they were trying to herd me back toward the tent. I stumbled, caught myself, and forced my breathing to steady, but the feeling only grew worse. Sarah's final words echoed through my mind, a warning, a plea. They wanted her to stay. And now I feared they wanted the same from me. As I broke through the denser part of the woods, I kept walking, feeling the weight of 100 unseen eyes on my back. And somehow, I knew the forest wasn't letting me go. Not yet. The forest grew darker as I pushed onward, the light fading faster than it should have. The trail twisted and curved, pulling me deeper into the thick underbrush, as if it had a will of its own. Shadows stretched out across the ground, pooling together like ink, and I could feel the presence of something lurking within them, watching every step I took. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of Sarah's journal, but some part of me knew better. As I walked, thunder rumbled in the distance, and a damp chill settled over everything, heavy with the scent of rain. It felt like a warning, a final push to turn back, but I was far beyond any easy exit now, and even if I'd wanted to leave, I wasn't sure I'd be able to find my way out. The trail narrowed ahead, and I realized with a sudden jolt that I was back near Sarah's campsite. I hadn't meant to return here. I'd tried to keep moving forward, away from this place, but somehow my feet had brought me right back to the hollow where her tent stood, like a silent monument to whatever had taken her. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the trees for an instant, and in that split second I saw them. Shadows, dark figures standing just beyond the tent. I took a step back, but she moved forward, her hand still outstretched. The shadows around her seemed to ripple and shift, as if they were alive, as if they were part of her. And then I saw them. The faces, flickering in and out of the shadows, pale and ghostly, their eyes empty. They were all watching me. Dozens of faces, all with that same hollow gaze, all reaching out with empty hands. A surge of panic shot through me and I stumbled back, heart racing. The shadows pressed closer, the air growing thick with whispers, voices calling my name, voices that sounded like Sarah, like the others who had vanished here over the years. "You shouldn't have come." The words drifted through the air, barely more than a breath, but I could feel their weight, pressing down on me, heavy and cold. I felt trapped, caught in the web of shadows, unable to move, unable to breathe. The rain was pouring now, sheets of water cutting down through the trees, but I could barely feel it. All I could feel was the presence around me, the weight of the eyes, the whispers clawing at my mind. With a final burst of strength, I tore myself away from the shadows, running blindly down the trail. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, to escape whatever horror was lurking in the depths of the forest. But the whispers followed, relentless, twisting around me, filling my head with fragments of words, promises, threats. I broke into a clearing, the rain pounding against my skin, and stopped, gasping for breath. But when I looked back, the shadows were there, waiting at the edge of the trees, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. I felt their pull, that strange, unexplainable urge to go back to them, to let them take me. "No," I whispered, forcing myself to turn away. I gripped the edge of Sarah's journal, feeling its cold, wet pages against my skin. This forest had taken her, claimed her, and it had nearly done the same to me. I started down the trail again, my steps unsteady but determined, the whispers fading as I put more distance between myself and the shadows. But the feeling lingered, the knowledge that I'd glimpsed something ancient, something powerful and dark, and that it was still there, waiting. The rain began to let up as I made my way out of the woods, but the chill in the air stayed with me. And somehow, I knew this was far from over. The storm had passed by the time I broke through the last line of trees, but the chill remained, settling deep into my bones as I stumbled down the narrow path back toward my truck. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird call, not a whisper of wind. It was as if the woods were watching me leave, letting me go but warning that I'd never truly escape. When I finally reached my truck, I collapsed against the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadows waiting at the edge of the trail. But there was only the thick fog hanging between the trees, obscuring whatever lay behind. It didn't feel like a comfort. It felt like a veil, hiding the darkness that lurked just beyond, waiting for someone else to wander in. I managed to steady my hands enough to turn the ignition. The headlights cut through the fog, and I watched as the mist swirled around them, coiling and shifting, almost alive. I sat there, gripping the wheel tightly, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from within the trees, waiting for me to look back. The journal lay beside me on the passenger seat, its cover damp and warped. I hadn't dared open it again since that last entry, since the sight of Sarah's desperate words scrawled across the pages. I felt as if the book itself was tainted, a relic of whatever ancient darkness had claimed her. But I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind, as though it were a piece of her that I couldn't abandon to those shadows. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those shadows hitching a ride, lurking in the back seat. The silence in the truck felt suffocating, pressing down on me like the weight of the forest itself. Even with miles stretching between me and Shenandoah, I couldn't shake the sense that the darkness had followed, that it had left its mark. I drove straight to the ranger station, hoping the familiar walls and the harsh fluorescent lights would break the spell. But when I stepped inside, the station felt foreign, as though the darkness had seeped into every corner, following me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I locked the door behind me and slumped into a chair, the weight of exhaustion settling over me. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face, pale and hollow-eyed, staring back at me from the depths of the forest. Her hand reaching out, asking for help, her voice a whisper that echoed through my dreams, mingling with the whispers of those shadowed figures. In the days that followed, I went through the motions at work, but it felt as if I were drifting, disconnected from everything around me. The others noticed, asking if I was all right, but I couldn't tell them. I could barely put it into words myself. How do you explain that you'd come face to face with something ancient, something that watched and waited in the darkness, something that took people who wandered too far. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I never expected my job to bring me to a place like this. The old St. Charles Asylum stood at the edge of town, its crumbling walls jutting up against the gray sky like a forgotten monument to a darker time. I had been a social worker for years, and I'd seen my fair share of difficult cases, but this was something else. My boss had handed me the assignment just that morning. "Keith, we need someone to go through the asylum's old records. Archive everything we can. They're rotting away and it's time someone took a look at them," she had said, her voice clipped and efficient as usual. I'd nodded, not quite registering what she meant by rotting away. But now, standing in front of the asylum's rusted gates, I had an unsettling feeling I was about to find out. I'd heard the rumors about the asylum before. Who hadn't? Built in the mid-1800s, it had been a place of care for the mentally ill, at least in theory. Over the years, though, its reputation soured. Patients were subjected to horrific treatments. Some claimed the building was haunted, though I had always written that off as folklore. There were whispers of a lost ward, a secret area of the asylum where the more difficult patients were kept. No one ever talked about it, but you could feel it if you listened closely enough. The assistant at the asylum, a pale man named Gary, had warned me on the way in. "Strange things happen here. You should be careful," he said, his eyes darting around the building as if he was afraid it might suddenly swallow him up. But I wasn't one to be spooked easily. I simply nodded and followed him inside. The archive room was tucked away on the third floor, behind a heavy door that creaked in protest when I opened it. The room smelled of mildew and dust, the kind of stale air that only comes from neglect. The shelves were crowded with brittle, yellowed papers, each file containing the lives of the people who had once walked the asylum's halls. I could hear the faint hum of the building's failing electrical system, a soft buzz that seemed to whisper its own story of decay. Gary gave me a nervous look before retreating back down the hallway, leaving me alone in the silence of the archive room. I didn't mind the solitude. There was something oddly comforting about it. But as I began sorting through the documents, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. The records were a mess. Pages were missing from files. Some names had been scratched out entirely. The more I dug through them, the stranger it became. There were whole sections of patient records that had been erased, and what was left behind seemed incomplete, like something had been deliberately left out. But who would erase these names, and why? As I skimmed through the files, one name caught my eye. The file was thin, almost empty, except for a few scattered notes. The patient's name was, strangely, nowhere to be found. Yet a reference to them appeared in almost every record. There was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the file from the shelf and started to read. The patient's last name was never mentioned, but there were several references to an incident involving a patient in the lost ward. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. The notes were filled with vague, cryptic language. The word experiment appeared a few times, but it was unclear what kind of experiment had been conducted. It didn't make sense. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each passing second an eerie reminder that time was somehow standing still in this place. I couldn't help but feel that there was more to this story than met the eye. Just as I was about to put the file back, I heard it. A soft whisper, like someone calling my name. My head snapped up. The room was still, the silence unnerving in its intensity. I tried to shake off the feeling. It must have been the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone. wasn't I? But the moment I returned my attention to the records, I heard it again. Faint, almost. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands as I closed the file. The whisper had been so faint, so fleeting, but it was unmistakable. It had sounded like someone was right behind me, close enough to feel their breath. I forced myself to laugh it off, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere of the old asylum and my overactive imagination. Still, the thought lingered as I resumed my work, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every so often, just to be sure I was still alone. The more I delved into the records, the more troubling the gaps became. Names were missing from entire sections, blacked out or scrubbed from existence. The files that were complete painted a grim picture. Descriptions of treatments that bordered on torture, references to isolation, and sometimes just a single cryptic word, unfit. The patients who had been labeled as such seemed to simply vanish from the records, as though they had never existed. One file caught my attention. A letter from a patient, written in shaky handwriting. It was barely legible, words slanted and scrawled in frantic bursts, as though the writer's hand had been trembling. The letter spoke of voices in the walls and shadows that watched from the corners of the room. But it was one line near the end that sent a chill down my spine. They say they've lost us, but we're right here. We're always here. As I read that line, a strange feeling settled over me, a sensation of being watched that prickled the back of my neck. I set the letter down and glanced around the dim archive room, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the shadows between the shelves. But the room was still, empty, or so I tried to convince myself. Determined to ignore the unease creeping through me, I went back to the letter, reading it again. The patient had mentioned the lost ward, the same hidden section of the asylum that I had come across in the earlier files. The references to it were vague, just whispers about a part of the building where patients were hidden away from the rest. But this letter seemed to confirm its existence, and something about the way the writer described it felt too real to be a mere legend. As I read on, my mind spun with questions. Where was this lost ward? Why would it have been hidden? And what exactly had happened there? A sudden sound interrupted my thoughts, a faint echoing creak that seemed to come from just outside the archive room. Then, just as I began to set the letter aside, a chill washed over me, and I felt it, a gentle, icy touch brushing my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sensation of that cold, lingering touch. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I stayed there, staring at the empty air beside me, heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just felt. But no matter how I tried to explain it away, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in the asylum, not anymore. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was watching me. The whispers, the cold touch on my shoulder, everything felt like a warning. But I couldn't leave. Something inside me told me I was close to uncovering something important, something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the missing records or the strange messages. It was the feeling of being drawn into a web I couldn't see, like the asylum itself was alive, and I was its next victim. The files I'd been sorting through had offered little more than fragmented clues, but I kept coming back to the lost ward. The more I read, the more I felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. It was as though the ward had been erased from history, scrubbed clean to hide its existence. Yet, the letters from the patients told a different story, one of torment, fear, and isolation. I was determined to find this ward, to see it for myself. I knew it had to be hidden somewhere deep in the asylum, its secrets locked away, just like the patients who had once roamed its halls. But where? There was no mention of it in any of the official records, no map that could lead me there. It was as though the ward was purposefully left out, a forgotten place buried beneath layers of history. But I couldn't ignore the pull. I had to find it. I spent the entire morning combing through more files, but the information remained vague. Patients speaking of strange noises, strange sights, and whispers in the dark. Some had even written about strange, experimental treatments, but the details were always blurry, fragmented. It was as if no one wanted to know the truth, or perhaps no one had lived long enough to tell it. I returned to the hallway where I had seen the word "help" scratched into the wall. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but the instinct to follow the clues was too strong to ignore. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the floor. The silence in the building was almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that every room I passed was holding its breath, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. At the end of the hallway, I found what I was looking for, a door, barely visible in the shadows. The wood was chipped, its edges rotting away, but it stood firm, as if protecting what lay behind it. A small brass plaque was affixed to the door, its words almost worn away by time. I leaned closer, squinting to read it. Authorized personnel only. It was strange. There was no indication that this room had ever been part of the official asylum plans. No records, no files, just a locked door, and the unmistakable feeling that I had found something I wasn't meant to see. I pushed the door open, the rusty hinges protesting with a loud screech that echoed down the corridor. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew, and the floor was covered in thick layers of dust. It was like stepping into another time, a place untouched by the years that had passed since the asylum had been abandoned. I switched on my flashlight and scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. It looked like an office. Old furniture, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with dusty boxes. But there was something strange about the room, something out of place. As I stepped further inside, I noticed a series of old photographs pinned to the wall, each one faded and yellowed with age. I approached the wall, studying the photos. I reached out, my fingers brushing the glass of the frame, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about the photograph unsettled me. It was almost as if the woman's eyes were following me, watching my every move. I turned away from the photo, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't fully understand. My flashlight swept across the rest of the room, and that's when I saw it. A set of old weathered documents stacked in a corner, just out of view. I approached them cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. As I picked up the first document, I noticed that it was a detailed map of the asylum. But there was something new, a section of the building that hadn't been marked on the official blueprints. It was a small area, hidden behind a series of locked doors and corridors. The map labeled it simply, "The Lost Ward." I felt a surge of excitement and dread wash over me as I stared at the map. I had found it. I had found the Lost Ward. And something deep inside me told me that I wasn't going to leave the asylum the same way I had entered it. I spent a few moments just staring at the map, feeling the weight of the discovery sink in. The Lost Ward was real. It wasn't just a rumor or a ghost story whispered around town. It was a physical place, buried deep within the asylum's walls. I felt a shiver of both anticipation and dread as I traced the path to the ward with my finger, noting each turn and hidden passage I'd need to take to reach it. The silence around me grew heavier, as if the building itself were holding its breath. waiting to see if I'd have the courage to step further into its depths. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave the asylum and let the secret stay buried. But the other part, the part that had always been driven by curiosity, couldn't let go of the chance to uncover the truth. I slipped the map into my jacket and started down the corridor, my footsteps echoing softly off the cracked tile floor. Following the directions on the map, I made my way through a series of narrow hallways and twisting staircases, each one darker and more claustrophobic than the last. The farther I went, the colder it seemed to get, as though the air itself was leaching the warmth from my skin. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself standing in front of an old iron door. This was it, the lost ward. My heart pounded as I reached out, running my fingers over the cold metal. The door seemed impossibly old, its surface pitted and scarred, as though it had been through countless storms and struggles. With a deep breath, I gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned, reluctant to open, but with one final tug it gave way, and I stepped into the darkness beyond. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay and mildew. My flashlight cast a weak beam across the corridor, revealing walls lined with iron bars and narrow doorways. This was no ordinary ward. It was more like a prison, a place meant to keep people locked away from the world. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the layers of dust that coated the floor. The cells on either side of the corridor were empty, but each one told its own story. Scratches covered the walls, some of them forming crude words and phrases. I felt a chill as I read through the notes. They described procedures I could barely comprehend, methods that seemed more like torture than treatment. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, and worse. Things that had been banned long ago. Things that were never meant to be used on human beings. And then, near the bottom of the pile, I found a journal. It was bound in faded leather, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, as though the writer had been racing against time. I opened to the first page and read the words written there. The voices have begun to follow me home. My hands shook as I read further, my heart pounding with each line. The journal belonged to Dr. Hawthorne himself. He described his descent into obsession, his growing fixation on finding a cure through extreme methods. But as I turned the pages, his notes became more frantic, more unhinged. He spoke of hearing voices in the walls, of shadows that followed him wherever he went. And then, at the very end, there was a final entry that chilled me to the bone. They won't let me leave. They're here with me now, in the walls, in my mind. They know my name, they know I tried to forget them, but they will not be forgotten. A loud crash shattered the silence, and I jumped, the journal slipping from my hands and landing on the floor with a heavy thud. My flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. I looked around, heart racing, but saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to pick up the journal, I heard it. A whisper, soft and haunting, echoing through the room. "Keith!" I backed away, heart pounding, as the whispers grew louder, filling the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief darkness I saw them. Faces in the shadows, watching me, their eyes filled with a silent, pleading terror. I stumbled backward, tripping over the journal and landing hard on the cold, unforgiving floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, calling my name over and over. And as the darkness closed in around me, I knew one thing for certain. The lost ward was never meant to be found. I don't remember how I managed to get back to the archive room. My mind was racing, my body numb with fear. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and the lost ward. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me, bracing my back against it as though that simple act could keep whatever I had just seen from following me. The whispers still echoed in my mind, calling my name, soft yet insistent, like they were trying to burrow their way into my thoughts. My heart pounded as I replayed what I had seen in the darkness. Those faces, twisted with fear, staring at me with pleading eyes. The terror in their expressions was etched into my memory, as vivid as if they were standing right before me. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to focus. I needed to understand what was happening, to piece together the scattered clues I'd uncovered. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing made sense. Why had Dr. Hawthorne gone to such lengths to hide the ward? And what had he done to those patients to leave their spirits lingering in the shadows? I slumped down into a chair, resting my head in my hands. My gaze fell on the pile of documents on the desk, and I noticed something strange. One of the files was open, though I was sure I had left it closed when I'd left. I picked it up, my hands still trembling, and skimmed through the contents. It was another patient record, describing a man named Edward Lane. Like the others, his file was incomplete, with certain details blacked out. But as I read further, I realized that Edward had been one of Dr. Hawthorne's experiments. His symptoms, delusions, paranoia, and hallucinations, had been treated with electroshock and forced isolation. But the final note in his file made my blood run cold. Subject unresponsive. Declared deceased. Remains unaccounted for. I stared at those last words, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. What did it mean, remains unaccounted for? And why did it seem like Edward's fate was not unique? Other patient files had similar notes, each one hinting at something darker, something hidden. Then I remembered the journal I had found in the lost ward. Dr. Hawthorne had written about hearing voices, about patients who would not be forgotten. I realized, with a sinking feeling, a soft creak pulled me from my thoughts, and I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat. The door was still closed, but the room felt different. The air was thick with tension, as though something unseen was watching me, waiting. I shook my head, trying to ignore the feeling. I was just exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow shifting along the wall. I turned to face it, my breath catching as I saw a faint figure standing there, its outline barely visible in the dim light. "Keith!" The whisper was louder this time, more insistent. The figure took a step closer, its form solidifying, and I could make out a face. A man with hollow eyes and a look of desperation etched onto his features. He stared at me, his gaze piercing, as though he were searching for something, pleading for something I couldn't understand. "Help me," he murmured, his voice barely audible, like a breath carried by the wind. My throat tightened as I tried to respond, but no words came out. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in the man's gaze as he reached out, his hand passing right through me as he faded back into the shadows. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. I had to get out of the asylum. I couldn't stay here any longer, couldn't let myself be pulled any deeper into its dark history. But even as I made up my mind to leave, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The whispers had followed Doctor. A chill ran down my spine, and I dropped the journal, backing away from the table. The silence in the room felt heavy, like a presence hovering just out of sight, waiting. I moved to the living room, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the sensation grew stronger with each passing moment. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every whisper of wind outside sounding like a faint voice calling my name. Then, just as I was about to turn on the TV to drown out the silence, I saw it. A reflection in the dark window across from me. A figure standing just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the spot where I had seen something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the asylum's ghosts had followed me home. I sat down, clutching the arm of the chair to steady myself, and closed my eyes. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the whispers were growing louder, echoing in my mind. Keith. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. My eyes flew open and I looked around, but there was no one there. Still, I felt the cold, faint pressure of fingers on my shoulder, just as I had in the archive room. The same sickly chill seeped into my bones, freezing me in place. I forced myself to stand, heart racing as I stumbled back into the kitchen. The files, the journal, the map, they were all still there. Remnants of the asylum's dark past, reminders of the horror I had uncovered. I knew what I had to do. I gathered everything, shoving the files, the journal, and the map back into my bag. I couldn't keep them here. Whatever I'd brought back from the asylum, I needed to return it, to leave it all behind, and hope that it would be enough to sever the asylum's hold on me. Without stopping to think, I grabbed my keys and hurried back to the car, my bag clutched tightly in my hands. The drive back to the asylum was a blur, the empty streets passing by in a haze as I pushed down the growing fear clawing at my chest. When I finally pulled up in front of the asylum, the building loomed before me, dark and silent. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I climbed out of the car and approached the entrance. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the asylum were waiting for me. I stepped inside, the cold enveloping me like a shroud. I made my way to the archive room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of air felt like the presence of the lost souls watching me, waiting for me to finish what I had started. In the archive room, I set the bag on the table and opened it, pulling out the files and spreading them out, as if returning them to their rightful place. The journal lay on top, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "I'm leaving this here. I'm sorry for disturbing you. Please, just let me go." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, I felt the cold begin to lift, as though the spirits that had haunted me were finally letting go, fading back into the shadows of the asylum. I left the archive room, not daring to look back. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, a lightness returning that I hadn't felt since the moment I'd set foot in the asylum. The whispers had gone silent, the presence that had followed me feeling distant, almost at peace. I walked to my car, taking one last look at the asylum. It stood silent and dark, its secrets buried once more. I knew I would never return to this place, never risk disturbing the restless spirits again. As I drove away, a sense of calm washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of the asylum would always stay with me, a shadow lurking just out of sight, a whisper waiting in the silence.